So please confirm me the PowerPoint presentation is visible on your screen. Is it visible?
No, sir.
Yes, sir, visible.
Yes.
Okay. So what we have discussed so far in our previous lecture, we discussed various sampling techniques. So we started with random sampling techniques, that was simple, stratified, and cluster random sampling. And today we're going to discuss about non-random or non-probability sampling techniques. What do I mean by non-random is that in order to have random sampling, you need to ensure that each and every subject has an equal chance to be selected. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you do not know the population. You do not have the information regarding each and every individual in that population. And sometimes even your access to the population is limited. In that case, you cannot continue with random sampling techniques that ensures randomization. Rather, what option you are left with is to go on with non-random sampling techniques. The prominent types of non-random techniques are quota sampling, judgmental sampling, accidental sampling, snowball sampling, and expert sampling. And now we're going to discuss each and every one of them in detail. So first thing, at any time, when you are going to see non-random, the first thing that you need to ensure that subjects, they do not have an equal chance of selection. And when subjects do not have an equal chance of selection, that leads us to another thing, that you cannot generalize your results to the entire population. And that's the punchline. That's the main concept of non-random sampling. And where we go with that approach when population is unknown. I will give you an example. For example, if someone is working with the wildlife species, any wildlife species in an area, do you think that anyone knows about how many individuals of wildlife species are there? We have estimates of population. If someone carried out a study on estimates, but we do not have any access to those animals. Give yourself a little bit time and think about all those species. Even consider all those deer species, consider all those carnivorous species. Even you do not know how many individuals of that species exist in an area because they're in the wild. And that population is unknown. And even if someone is going to collect the data and he has some sample and he manages to trap animals, only few animals they can be trapped. And that trapping does not ensure the randomization. I mean, any animal can be trapped, but that do not ensure the randomization because you do not have that option to just look at them all and then from that you ensure the randomization. So in that case, the concept of random sampling will not be applicable there. And secondly, if I simply ask you about the entire population of district Mirpur, do you have any access to that entire population? You know each and every individual in that population? No, you do not know. Very, very large. In that case, we cannot adopt the random sampling techniques. Population is unknown. You do not have ID of each and every one. You do not have access to each and every one. And then it's a very large thing. So you cannot continue with random sampling techniques. So the option you are left with is to go on with non-random sampling techniques. The first one is the quota sampling. Quota refers to mean how much sample do you want in your research. Let's suppose if you decide that I will going to collect the data from 500. So this is the quota you decide that I will going to collect 500 samples from this population. And this is the quota I will going to decide. And that quota will depend on my ease of access. Whatever I will going to access, I will going to include them until unless I will keep on carrying out my research until unless my desirable samples will be achieved. For example, if I am working on sandflies and I decide that in order to carry out taxonomic studies or something regarding the distribution, I will going to collect 5,000 sandflies. That's the quota I decide. And then I will going to keep on trapping sandflies until unless I reach that figure that is 5,000. So here you decide a number and you achieve that number. You achieve that number without going through randomization. You simply, for example, if the prominent example is that, okay, if I'm interested to take data from 500 students of the university, I will just stay on the gate and I will going to keep on collecting data from people until unless I will going to get 500. So anyone on passing through that gate, I will going to approach that person and ask about that. For example, if I am working on either their age, their education status, either their income status, so I will going to ask that question to everyone who is just moving through that gate. And once I will going to achieve my number, that's it. What are the advantages? The advantages of the quota sampling is that it's least expensive. You just need to stand on a gate. You just decide a location for yourself and then keep on screening all those in. Second is that for quota sampling, when you decide something, you do not need information regarding each and every one in the population. Disadvantage is more or less same for every non-quota sampling, that it cannot be generalized to whole population. Why cannot be whole? Because those individuals that are selecting, you are selecting, may have some unique characters and they are not representative of all population. For example, if those people, for example, if you go to the gate that is on the south of the university, only those people who are coming to the university from the south side, who are using that road, they will be selected, while all those people who are using other ways to or other routes to the university, they will not be selected. So as the character in that case was just that, okay, you just decided a gate, and in that case, that gate was maybe on the south or it's on the north or east of the university, eastern gate of the university. In that case, only those people who will visit there who are coming from that direction. So unique characteristics, and it cannot, they can also, people coming from the south, they cannot be representative of all people in the university. So that's quota. And accidental is same as quota, but without any visible character. Why without any visible character mean? You just go, just decide a spot that is random spot. For example, if I am going to decide the main chowk of district Mirpur and just stay there and ask question, and I just, if any person that passes through that way by chance, that's why it's named as accidental. So I will going to ask that question from that person. And once my sample size will be achieved, I just stop my collecting the data and then I will going to finish my data collection. So as accidentally similar to the quota. So the advantages and disadvantages, they are more or less same. Another type of non-random sampling is the judgmental sampling. What do we mean by the judgmental sampling? Is that a researcher normally makes a judgment, makes a decision that who can provide that information. What do we mean by this? That, for example, if I want to look at some of the aspects that are relevant regarding the education, so I will going to make a judgment. I will going to select a university. I will going to select some educational institute. Maybe I will going to select a professional institute for my information. And maybe you have seen so many people who are sending questionnaires to you that, okay, I'm carrying out that kind of research and I want your opinion, because that decision of the samples is just based on the researcher judgment, that they feel that you have the capacity to give us that kind of information, while all those people who are illiterate, who never visited any institute, they do not have that kind of capacity. They do not have that kind of information. If you need an information regarding the agriculture and you are carrying out a research in a population, in that case, you will going to select those people who are relevant to the agriculture. For example, you will going to choose the farmers and the agriculture departments, and you will going to collect information from those people, because you feel that those people, they can provide you the information, while the rest of the population, they do not have that capacity to give you that kind of information. So that's a judgmental. That's based on the researcher judgment. That's based on the researcher opinion, that okay, these are the sets of people who can give me that kind of information. Once again, if you look at the advantage, you get that information rapidly, and you are going to have very few refusals, because people, they are already informed about it and they are relevant for that field. Disadvantage, once again, they only just represent only people who have these unique characters, and you cannot generalize that results to the entire population. And the last one is the expert sampling. Expert sampling is very similar to the judgmental sampling, but it's different in a sense that sampling is being conducted from only the expert of that field. People who are qualified in that field. For example, if you want to collect a data regarding the health status of any community, and you just choose in your sample only the health practitioners. So now your subjects, they are all expert of that field. And because of that specific character, you choose them, that okay, you are collecting information from only the health professionals. They are experts of that field. So this is the only difference between the judgmental and the expert sampling. Another way to carry out non-random sampling is snowball sampling. And this is very, very useful when you have very limited access to an organization. The population is very, very much unknown to you. It's something very new, and you do not have lots and lots of information. And even you do not have lots and lots of contact in that specific organization or group. For example, if you visit a village, and this is known as the snowball sampling. If you visit a village and that village is absolutely unknown to you, and in that village you have maybe 1 or 2 contacts, and from those 1 or 2 contacts you collect the information and you collect data, and then you request those contacts to introduce you with maybe 1 or 2 more people who can give you that kind of information. So once those initial contacts, they introduce you with few more people. And then you collect information from them, and then you ask them again that, okay, introduce us to few more people so that we can collect more information. That is more based on personal context. And this is very much practiced online as well, that you write up to a person, a request you already know, and then request that person to give you information, and then you collect data from that, and then you request that person that, okay, please introduce me to few more people that I can collect data from there. And in this way, once you collect data from them, and then you ask them, okay, introduce to more, than in this way, you ultimately achieve the sample size, whatever you have decided for yourself. So it's a snowball. And that is very, very much useful when something is very, very much unknown to you. You visit an organization, you know only very few people, you ask them for data, and then you ask them to introduce to someone else who can give you data. And then once you get data from them, you ask them to do it again. And in this way, your sample size will keep on increasing. And in that case, there is one thing that in that case, your sampling cannot be random, because it depends on the contact of your initial contacts, and then it depends on this. So only a specific component there, they will be introduced to you, and they cannot be generalized to the entire concept. And then we have another topic, that is the systematic sampling. Systematic sampling mixed has characters of both random and non-random sampling. The population is normally divided into groups called interval, and are ordered, and then ordered the sampling based on first sample, and then eventually every 15 element is being selected. For example, you just in the first step, you decide and divide them into groups. For example, if I will go into group a population, let's suppose I make 4 groups, and here I will going to initially decide that, okay, I will going to collect data. For example, if I just grouped it and I decide 4 institutes here for data collection. And in that institute, what I have decided initially, that I will going to collect data from every 5th person I meet. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I will going to miss first 4, and then I will going to collect information from 5th. And then I will going to miss another 4, and then I will going to collect information from 10th. And in this way, I will going to keep on continue until unless I will going to achieve the sample size. And that concludes my discussion on sample size. Do you have non-random samplings? Do you have any question regarding this? So I have a prayer call in my background. So
sir, systematic sampling. Sir, systematic sampling की समझ नहीं आई. Can't इसको repeat कर दें आप?
Okay, I have a prayer call on my background. Just wait for a couple of minutes, and then I will going to explain.
Okay, sir.
I'm just looking for a blaze. Is the slide visible to you, and can you hear my voice?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In systematic sampling, first you make groups. Okay. I group my population in 4 on the basis of anything: A, B, C, and D. So after the grouping, for example, I need 10 samples from A. So how I will going to collect the 10 samples from A? That I will going to decide a number for me. It can be any number. Let's suppose 6. So what I will going to do, that once I will go there for data collection, so I will going to meet person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and what I have decided for myself that I will going to collect data from every 6 person. So once I will going to reach to the number 6, I will going to collect data from that person. And then I will going to let go 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th once I visit any place. I will not going to collect any data from them. Rather, then I will going to collect my 6th, and then I will going to 12. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I will going to ignore them. And then I will going to collect data from 12. So that means I have decided. So as I have decided that I will going to collect data from every 6th person I meet. So I will ignore 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and then I will going to collect data from 6th one. Then 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11, they got ignored, and then I will going to collect data from 12th one. Then I will going to ignore it, and then I will going to collect data from 18th person I meet. Then I will going to collect data from 24th person I meet. Then I will going to collect data from 30th person I meet. And in this way it will. So you just decide that after how many observations you are going to collect the data, after how many subjects you collect the data. So here it's just the multiplication of 6. That 6th person, and then 12th person, then 18th person, then 24th person I meet, and then 30th person I meet, 36th person I meet, and then it's 42nd person I meet, 48th person I meet. So in this way you can just reach to the sample size. Gentlemen, is it clear? So it's a systematic way that you decide, okay, every
Yes,
5th
sir, clear.
So that concludes my discussion on sampling techniques. And now we're going to discuss about the sample size. So sample size. Depends on certain thing. I mean, what should be your sample size? That's a question. Whether it's a random trial or it's non-random sampling. The first thing you need to do is to decide about the sample size. What sample size is suitable for your research? For example, you cannot collect a data of 10 people from the university and then on the basis of that 10 people, you decide about the entire university. So sample size depends on many factors. The first thing is that what do you want to do with the findings? Whether you want to journalize your findings, whether you want to claim about some restricted group, I mean, it depends what do you want with your findings. And secondly, what kind of relationship do you want to establish? At what confidence level do you want to test your results or finding the hypothesis? When it comes to the confidence level, that's more technical, like that whether you want to be 90% confident. So these are some default values. You can decide your confidence level. Whether you want to be 80%, whether it's 95%, and sometimes it's 99% confidence. 99% confidence means that there is 1% chance of error. 95% confidence means if there is 5% error is being tolerated. 90% confidence means 10% error is being tolerated. 80% confidence means there is a 20% error that is being tolerated. So it depends on the nature. If you are conducting a research that involves human health, that could have a very, very serious consequences. In that case, maybe you are going to decide your confidence level up to 99%. If the research is very, very sensitive. If you are carrying out a research on wildlife and you know that you cannot maintain that accuracy, in that case, maybe you will going to decide your 90%. So it's all up to you. When we say, so when in hypothesis testing, normally you will going to see a word like this, level of significance. And we represent it by alpha. Have you seen that?
Yes, sir.
Alpha, what is this? This is error. How much error you are ready to tolerate? By default, in statistical testing, we keep 5% error. So your level of significance is 0.05, that means 5%. That means there is 5% chance of error in your testing. And more specifically, it's a type 1 error. Because in hypothesis testing, you have two types of error. And let me show you. That will be VM from your. Where is it? So normally when you test your hypothesis, there is always a possibility of error. And there are 4 possibilities. This is the reality in population. So this is reality in population. What do you mean by this? That what's going on in the population? So in the population, maybe the null hypothesis is accepted. And in the population, maybe the alternate hypothesis is accepted. So I was going to simply write down the word alternate as I do not have space. Maybe alternate hypothesis is accepted. So these are your test results when you carry out hypothesis testing. After conducting any test of hypothesis testing, there is a possibility that you accept a null hypothesis, and there is a possibility that you accept the alternate hypothesis. This is reality in population, and these are your test results. If the null hypothesis is accepted in the population and your test result also accepted the null hypothesis, in that case you made the right decision. And if null hypothesis is rejected in the population, that means alternate hypothesis is accepted. In that case, and your test results also reject the null hypothesis and accept the alternate hypothesis, in that case you made the right decision. So these are your correct decisions. What you have tested is absolutely right. And there is a possibility that in the population, null hypothesis is accepted. That's the reality. While in your test, based on your sample data, you manage to reject that null hypothesis. In that case, your decision is wrong. Your test result rejected the null hypothesis. So here you made a wrong decision. And that means you have committed an error here. When null hypothesis is accepted in the population, but you reject it. Because the reality in population is that the null hypothesis is accepted, but in your testing, you rejected it. So it's an error. And we name that error as type 1 error. And people, they represent it with alpha. And the fourth possible situation in nature that is possible, that in the population, the null hypothesis is being rejected, but in your testing, you just accepted the null hypothesis. Once again, you are wrong. And as you are wrong, you have committed an error. And that error, we name it as the type 2 error. And we represent it with beta. So now I'm going to ask you a question. That when you test the hypothesis, there are some uniform tests in hypothesis testing. That's from your understanding what you have discussed during your what you learned during the course of biostatistics, is that there are some uniform steps in hypothesis testing. The first step is always the development of hypothesis. What is the second step, gentlemen? Any volunteer?
Sir, level of significance.
The second step is the level of significance. And you represent it with alpha. And the third step of hypothesis testing is the test statistics. I have already briefly told you that what kind of tests are applied on what kind of data, so I will not going to comment on this. But now I will ask you a critical question. That this level of significance is your alpha, and actually it's type 1 error. While when I show you that specific sketch, accept my apologies for such a poor handwriting. Hopefully you understood it. That when I told you about the errors in hypothesis testing, there are two types of error. One is the type 1 error, that is alpha, and other is the type 2 error, that is beta. While when you test the hypothesis, you just take the responsibility of only one kind of error, that is alpha, that we decide as level of significance, another common name for it, that how much error you are ready to tolerate. And that's type 1 error. Why you do not consider the type 2 error? That's my first question, and then I will going to explain. Why you simply ignore the type 2 error? You have 1 minute to respond to this question. And for all those people who are there in this class and they feel, because you already have a course of biostatistics during your masters, and I do not have lot of time to discuss that course in much more detail. So if you feel that you have missed something from the course of biostatistics, in that case you can just go with my lectures available on YouTube for detailed course of biostatistics, and you can just select any topic, and then you will hopefully you will have understanding regarding this. So here I will going to directly ask you a question, that why we do not take the responsibility of beta in hypothesis testing? It's only alpha.
Sir, actually it is rejected by the population.
I fail to understand what do you want to say. Please explain it in more detail.
Sir, actually null hypothesis is rejected by population, but we have we don't have sufficient data to reject it. That's why we definitely accept it.
I mean, there are two types of error na? In hypothesis testing.
सर मैं टाइप 2 की बात कर रहा हूँ.
तो टाइप 1 की तो आप बताते हैं, लेकिन टाइप 2 क्यों नहीं बताते? That's what I want to ask. Why you do not take the responsibility of type 1 and type 2 error in hypothesis testing? If there would be a level of significance alpha, and there must be some level of significance beta, why? Let me go to with a blank diagram. Normally, when you test the hypothesis, once again there is a lot. Let me create a new blank slide. When we test the hypothesis, there are two possibilities. That maybe we're going to reject the null hypothesis. That's one possibility. Maybe we're going to reject the null hypothesis. Or we accept the null hypothesis. In hypothesis testing, when we apply a test, we look for the evidences to reject the null hypothesis. Another way to say it, that we never prove the null hypothesis. And hopefully you remember that example of a crow color that is black. And I gave it that example that if the crow is being, if someone claims that all those birds of crow, they are black in color, and if that person has a data of 3 million people, 3 million birds, 4 million birds, 10 million birds, still with certainty the person cannot be sure that all birds, they are black in color. Maybe there is some bird at any part of the world that is white in color, but once someone has found a single bird that is other than the black color, with certainty the person can claim that, okay, all the birds, they are not black in color. So in hypothesis testing, that also applies the same. The story will remain the same. That we look for the evidences to reject the null hypothesis. In a hypothesis testing, we never ever prove the null hypothesis. So if we get those evidences, we reject the null hypothesis, and this is our claim. But if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, in that case, we accept the null hypothesis. And when we accept the null hypothesis in hypothesis testing, we do not claim that the null hypothesis is true. That's not our claim. Rather, what our claim in hypothesis testing, that when we accept the null hypothesis, that means we do not have the sufficient evidences to declare it wrong. We do not have the sufficient evidences to declare it wrong. That's why we are accepting it. Acceptance does not mean true. Rather, we said that we do not have evidences to reject the null hypothesis. That's why we accept the null hypothesis. But acceptance does not mean true. That means we do not have any finding. That's why when you accept the null hypothesis, you say that your results are non-significant, because you never ever prove the null hypothesis. As you do not have any claim, as you do not prove the null hypothesis, so that burden of type 2 error is not on you. Because when you accept the null hypothesis, you simply mean that you do not have the evidences to reject the null hypothesis. That's why you are accepting it, but you are not actually proving the null hypothesis. That's why as all those testing, they involve those testing, they make an attempt to reject the null hypothesis. That's why the burden of mistake can only towards the rejecting the null hypothesis. That's why we claim the responsibility of type 1 error, and we do not claim any responsibility of type 2 error. Because when we accept the null hypothesis, that means we do not declare it true. We just say that we do not have the evidences to reject it. Because we never ever prove the null hypothesis. Is it clear? Just feel comfortable and ask. Is it absolutely okay?
Yes, sir.
Anyone has any question? You have 1 minute to think on this, and then we will going to continue. Now I will switch back to sample size. So that sample size also depends on what confidence level do you want to test your results. Either with what confidence do you want, how much type 1 error you are ready to tolerate. Is it 5%, 1%, 10%, 20%? And from this, I have another question from you. If we can decide an error, why we do not always make it 1%, and then why we sometimes become flexible to tolerate more errors like 5%, 10%, and 20%? If we have that option to choose, that we must need to just decide 1% error all the time. Why 5%, 10%, 20%? And secondly, why we cannot eliminate the error? That's the second question. That is the test of your memory as well as the test of your learning with reference to the course of biostatistics. If it is your decision that you can choose whether you want to choose 1%, whether you want to choose 5%, whether you want to choose 10%, whether you want to choose 20%. Why not you choose 1% all the time?
सर ये तो हमारी रिसर्च के ऊपर डिपेंड करता है ना। बाज़ दफ़ा हमें सेंसिटिविटी के लिहाज से कम एरर रखना पड़ता है, जैसे 99% हम रखते हैं तो 1% एरर टॉलरेट कर सकते हैं हम। समटाइम 99.9% भी होता है, और समटाइम अगर सेंसिटिविटी नहीं है तो हम उसको कम भी रख सकते हैं, जैसे 90 पे रख के हम 10% भी कर सकते हैं उसको।
Even if your experiment is not very sensitive, there is nothing wrong with selecting a very small error. Why not we select small error all the time?
Sir, due to data fluctuation?
I absolutely disagree with this.
Oh.
The answer is in front of you because I switched to a slide that shows me a graph of normal distribution with those critical regions highlighted, zones of rejection as highlighted. Just feel comfortable. Just try to think on this and then tell me. So I will ask you a question that this is the graph of normal distribution. And here you have that normal curve. And in that curve, you have those critical regions or zones of rejection, they are being highlighted. So when we test anything, for example, if we apply the test and we have some critical values, and here with this, that's related to a large sample size, so this is 1.96. That must be a z-test critical value. And that's telling me that anything that will go beyond that will be rejected. And anything that is less than minus 1.96 will also be rejected. So that's the zone of rejection. So if I will going to decide 5% error, that means that 5% will be distributed equally. 2.5% on upper side and 2.5% on lower side. And remaining 95% will be in the middle, that where I have confidence that I cannot be wrong. So now I will ask you a question. And normally we have tables there, and those tables, they have some values, and these values are being developed on the basis of probability distributions. And those values, they tell you about give you information regarding the critical region. So anything greater than that, and this is somewhat your tabulated value, that anything greater than that, you will going to reject it, and anything that is less than that, you will going to accept it, without considering that if it is two samples, so you just need to consider without considering the negative and the positive side. So that's entire zone is acceptance zone, and these zones, they are rejection zone. So once you carry out any test, after that test, you will going to get a value, and that we name that value as calculated value. For example, if you will get a calculated value, let's suppose in this case as 0.14, that means it's less than 1.96. So in that case, that falls in the acceptance zone. So in that case, you will not going to reject your null hypothesis, you will going to accept the null hypothesis. And if you're going to get a calculated value like 3.15, in that case, you will going to reject the null hypothesis because it's greater than that critical value. Is it clear to this point? Because that's something reviewed from your course of biostatistics. Is it clear? Just feel comfortable.
No, no, sir.
Normally, you have already developed tables available. So they are developed and they have calculated those probabilities of falling in the zone of rejection. And normally they have some values. That's why you have a separate table for t-test, you have separate table for z-test. And those z-test and t-test tell you about that critical value, that if you will go beyond that value, you will going to reject it. In case of z-test, you have a value of 1.96 at 5%. And then they have also calculated those critical values at 10%. 10% must be somewhere here. And they have also calculated those values for 1%. And even they have calculated values for 20% as well. So these are all critical values. Maybe at 10%, if it is a two-tailed test, the value is 1.68. So from here, your rejection starts. At 20%, maybe it's like 1.26. So 1.68 at 10% and at 20% is 1.26. Let's suppose. So these are all critical values. And if your calculated value after carrying, for example, t-test, z-test, if your calculated value goes greater than that, it will be rejected. That means your sampling falls here and you will going to reject it that, for example, if you are claiming out the mean, you are going to say the mean, they are not equal. These are the zones of rejection. Do you remember that? And we calculate these, although these tables, they are already available on those books of statistics, but still you can calculate it through probability distribution. So that's a complicated topic, but still you can use them as a reference. You do not need to calculate them again and again. So these are just reference values. They are available everywhere. You have a separate table for t-test. You have a separate table for f-test, and you have a table for chi-square, where they give you those values, those critical values, where you need to reject it. Do you remember? Is it clear?
Yes, sir, clear.
Because in order to tell you about all those values, I have to discuss all those probability distributions once again. So above that value, you normally reject it. So for the scope of this course, what I want to tell you, that if I were going to eliminate everything, remove everything, whatever I have shown you, erase everything. So here I will going to write down only two values. One is the critical value, here is 1.96. And here you have a critical value that is minus 1.96. And they are already available. So anything greater than that, you will going to reject it. That's why it is named as a critical zone or zone of rejection. So my question is that, so inside these both zones, this is all acceptance zone. So my question is that where you can have the type 1 error. You can have type 1 error only in the zone of rejection. Do you agree with this?
Yes, sir.
Because type 1 error is that when by mistake you reject a true null hypothesis. When you will going to reject the true null hypothesis when you have value somewhere here. And that also applies to this zone as well. So I'm not replicating it. So you can have type 1 error in the rejection zone only. Is it clear?
Yes, sir, clear.
And where you can have the type 2 error? Now I want to ask you. Where you can have type 2 error? Please tell me. The type 2 error is only possible in the zone of acceptance, because we define the type 2 error as the probability of accepting a wrong null hypothesis. So that must be in the acceptance zone. So this is the zone where you can have the type 2 error. Is it clear? So type 2 error in hypothesis testing is probability of accepting a wrong null hypothesis. So when you accept a wrong null hypothesis, that's type 2 error. So what is going to happen? That if at any time when you try to reduce the type 1 error, the type 2 error will going to increase. And now if you just reduce the type 1 error to, let's suppose, from 5% to 2.5%. Now initially it was 1.96. Now the value will going to, your critical value will now be like 2.38, let's suppose. So previously at 5%, with 5% error, you were rejecting the null hypothesis at 1.96, and now you are rejecting the null hypothesis at 2.38. So now the rejection will be, the chances of rejection will be less and less. Because everything that, for example, if your value is 2, previously it was rejected at 1.97, but at 2.38, it no longer will be rejected. And if you decrease that type 1 error to, let's suppose, to 1%, now your critical value will now increase. Maybe it's at 3.36. And now your probability of rejecting the null hypothesis will be less and less. It will be more less than 2.5%. It will be very much less than 5%. It will be less than 10%. So now you will going to accept the null hypothesis, accept all those values that are between 1.96 and 3.36. And all those values which are previously being rejected, now as you reduce the type 1 error, now you are not rejecting them. As you are not rejecting them, that means the probability of your rejection has decreased. In order to reject at 1%, your results must have a very, very much significant deviation. And those evidences for rejection must be very, very strong to reject at 1%. And if you make that error to the 0, in that case, your critical value will be something infinity. That means you will no longer will be able to reject anything. That's why you cannot have error 0, because the critical value will become infinite. As your critical value will become infinite, what will going to happen? That you will not going to reject anything, and when you will not going to reject anything, that means you will be accepting the null hypothesis all the time, despite of data whatever you have, despite of all those evidences whatever you have to accept that there will be no rejection. And the problem is that in statistical testing, we look for the evidences to reject the null hypothesis. And if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, that means we do not have any finding. We simply say that we accept it and the null hypothesis because we do not have the evidence to reject it. That's why the studies in which we have more and more control. For example, if you are carrying out a study in a lab, there you will have more control. So if the null hypothesis is being rejected, your data will going to support that, and you can have a very strong support. And you can decide, choose 1% level of significance. While if the study is somewhere in the field where you do not have lots and lots of control, what will be the consequences? You cannot get those very strong evidences. So you just need to be fluctuate in order to get any result that, okay, you decide for 5%, 10% or 20%. Is it clear? Just feel comfortable and tell me. Is it clear? I'm waiting for your response. Rather a kind response.
So it means we can only reject null hypothesis. We cannot prove it.
Yes. In statistical testing, we do not look for the evidences to prove the null hypothesis. We only look for the evidences to reject it. And as we decrease the type 1 error, the type 2 error is going to keep on increasing. Because type 1 error falls in the critical zone and type 2 error falls in the acceptance zone.
सर टाइप 1 अगर हम रिड्यूस कर रहे हैं, इसका मतलब है हम टॉलरेंस इंक्रीज कर रहे हैं टाइप 1 की.
What do you mean by this?
सर मैं ये कह रहा हूँ अगर हम टाइप 1 एरर को रिड्यूस कर रहे हैं, इसको 1.96 से आपने कहा कि 3.36 तक हम लेके जा रहे हैं या 2 पॉइंट समथिंग तक लेके जा रहे हैं इसे, तो इसका मतलब है हम टाइप 1 की जो मतलब इसको बर्दाश्त करते हैं हम वो इंक्रीज कर रहे हैं, टॉलरेंस इसकी इंक्रीज कर रहे हैं.
No, we just make sure, we just ensure more and more accuracy. In order to ensure more and more accuracy, we are making that value more and more difficult. That if some difference is really significant, in that case, that will be rejected. We need a very strong evidence to reject at 2.3%. At 1.96%, it's comparatively less than 2.36%. So when we can reduce the type 1 error, but when we reduce the type 1 error, over capacity to reject the null hypothesis will also reduce. Because our now critical value will keep on increasing. Is it okay?
Yes, sir.
So that's a gamble. a gamble between your control on your research and your capacity to reject the null hypothesis. That's why we decide 1% error, we decide 5% error, we decide 10% error, decide 20% error on the basis of the control as well as on the basis of nature of experiment. Is it a very, very sensitive study, or is it something that we can tolerate a little bit more error? So your sample size also depends on this. That what level of confidence do you want to test your results? Is it at 95% confidence? Is it at 99% confidence? Is it at 90% confidence, 80%? And secondly, your sample size also depends on what accuracy do you want in your estimates when you try to estimate any parameter. And how much variations are there? Because when you increase the variation, you have to increase the sample size. And just do remember all those things which we discussed regarding the standard error. That when your variations are there, you need a greater sample size. If you see less variations, you can continue with the moderate sample size. And the most important thing is your resources. How much you have the resources. So on the basis of your resources, you decide the sample size. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
So these are just formula, and here you will going to see about like 95% confidence interval. What do you mean by the 95% confidence? That I am 95% confidence that my results are true. My findings are true.
We have 5%
error.
5% tolerance.
Error. There is a possibility of 5% error in our findings. That's more appropriate. There is 5% possibility that there will be error in my findings. So these are few formulas. I am not teaching you statistics. That's why I'm not going in more detail of this. Is it clear? Secondly, we have softwares through which we can calculate the sample size. So before conducting any research, and that depends on the total population, that depends on standard deviation, that depends on mean if proportions. If you are using with nominal scale, for example, if you are looking for a prevalence of a disease, in that case, the sample size will depend on how much what's the previous prevalence of the diseases. So all these stuff, they will help you. So when you calculate the sample size, sometimes you need a standard deviation. As you haven't conducted any study previously, so as you need a standard deviation, so the source of standard deviation could be either you guess a standard deviation that much deviation is expected, or you consult an expert that how much deviation is there in the population, because you need the standard deviation of population. Secondly, the other sources could be previous studies and the pilot studies. You can consult them and then insert that in the formula, and you will going to calculate the sample size. That concludes my discussion for today. If you have any questions, just feel free and ask. Otherwise, I will going to end the meeting.